Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine that we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy, distributed amongst you for your knowledge base so that when you go off and you run into somebody at a holiday party or at a water cooler somewhere and they start going off about this, that, or the other thing, you have facts to back it up and you can have a reasonable conversation. Please, no yelling and screaming. That's usually for our friends on the left. Our first guest this week, it picks up on a story that if in the binary world that we live in, you're going to hear us say this and you're going to say, Joe, you sound like you're against all these jobs being created in Virginia. And that's really not what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about a great piece from Mercatus and the George Mason University. The Mercatus Center is one of our favorite places to go to find the good reasoned thought. Michael Ferran is on with us. He's written a piece called Amazon Headquarters. The Losers Are the Winners. And Michael, welcome to the program. How are you doing this week? And thanks for joining us.
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
We hear this, and I hear a lot of the same stuff coming around the GM story this past week of we're having trouble as a business and the government needs to help and their jobs and the union reps are screaming, what are you going to do about this? And I guess the populist in a raw democracy is going to run for the votes first. And this leads us into cronyism all over the place. Then you'll hear people saying, well, the rest of the world does business this way and the big governments are all part of the business community. So we should be just like the other kids on the playground. But take us into the decision to move Amazon's headquarters, or at least one of Amazon's East Coast headquarters, to the D.C. area. It didn't surprise me anything, but and why your contention is that the losers are really the winners in this.
Well, the basic reason why Amazon is moving to Arlington and to New York City is because that is where the tech talent is located that it needs to actually, produce the things that it produces, the internet web services. And so this actually parallels a lot of research on this topic previously that says that where companies locate doesn't depend strongly on the incentives or the subsidies that local governments offer to entice the companies to locate in a particular place. In fact, they only matter between 2 and 25% of the time at the most.
Wow.
Meaning that only 3 out of 4 times did they actually change a company's decision of where to locate. So that means that it's a waste of resources, of public resources, in order to offer these subsidies. And that's why I say that the losing cities may actually be the winners, because now Virginia and New York City are going to be on the hook for billions of dollars in subsidies that could actually go to tax cuts for other companies, for all companies, or for increased public services for the local residents.
Well, it's always been my contention when I hear these deals and I hear the tax incentives laid out there saying, well, if you're saying this, then you're sort of tacitly admitting that our corporate taxes are a detriment to business. So why don't we ever really make a good case that you should be cutting them for everybody in the first place, Michael?
Well, no, that is exactly the case that we make in our recent research paper. Taxes, by their very nature, this is just the economics of the situation. This isn't a particular political viewpoint. Taxes, by their very nature, introduce a certain amount of waste into the economy. They waste resources because they misallocate where people spend their money. And there's a lot of economics behind that. But take that just for granted for the moment. And then the math suggests that the higher that the tax rate is, the greater that the economic loss is. And it's at an accelerating rate. It's a non-linearly increasing rate. So if your tax rate is 10%, the economic waste is more than double the tax rate of 5%. So what we suggest is if you want to increase economic growth by reducing taxes, then the better way to do it is to give a broad-based tax cut for all companies that would reduce and less economic waste due to the inherent nature of taxes, rather than one very large tax cut for one particular company.
It has always struck me anecdotally, and your research really kind of puts pencil to paper on something that I've seen over the 30 years I've been doing this Insider Radio, is that a government dollar doesn't go nearly as far as a private sector dollar, and that if you want more people to have housing, if you want more people to have food or education, the private sector is always going to fund it more efficiently and get more bang out of it than the government is. So it certainly seems like that bears out in what you see here in this research.
Absolutely. Part of the issue here is that politicians, when they make these kind of subsidy offers to companies, they're not investing their own money. In fact, they're not just investing taxpayer money. Generally, they're investing future taxpayer money. Yeah. And so they don't have a strong incentive to make the absolute best deal. They just want to be seen as doing something to benefit the economy and to benefit their local community that will get them votes in the future. That sounds a little cynical, but that's the result of really good research by Nate Jensen at the University of Texas and Edmund Milewski at Duke University in a book called Incentives to Pander. They find that politicians focus on essentially the deals that even if the deals don't work, the politicians are engaging in them because it's a way to curry voters' favor. So that suggests that one of the ways out of this in the future is to reverse what people think of these deals, that giving billions to Amazon is a good thing to do, that it stimulates the local economy. And that's part of what our research is trying to educate people on, that Amazon was very likely going to locate in Northern Virginia and New York City anyway,
right,
and that any money offered to them is simply a waste of resources.
I've seen this in impoverished areas, Michael. We're visiting with Michael Ferran from the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, and it's about Amazon's East Coast headquarter splitting the baby, 2 headquarters for the price of, 4, it sounds like, mathematically, when it comes to the tax incentives. But for years, every time I've ever been around a poor community, whether they've lost the steel industry or they've lost the tire industry or you name it, whatever Rust Belt community it's been, eventually somebody comes along and foists the idea of tax increment financing. And I've always warned people that if there's a phrase that should make you run for the hills, it's sort of, I don't know if you ever watched cartoons as a kid, the old Popeye cartoons. There was a character who was always saying, "I'd gladly pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today." It is sort of what tax increment financing always seems to pencil out to be, which is you're going to pay much higher taxes in the future for deals that aren't going to change the economic landscape of the city, but it will, pay some builders to build some storefronts or to brick a downtown mall over today. And it sounds like that's the same kind of thing Amazon went out looking for, is who is going to do that future tax base shell game now.
That touches on a lot of really interesting points, and I love that character. I can't remember his name right now, but I know exactly what you're talking about. Maybe what we should think of this as is, rather than "I'd gladly pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today," my friend, who is not part of this deal, would gladly pay you Tuesday for a hamburger for me today.
Yes, exactly.
Because the rest of Virginia and the rest of the state of New York is getting roped in to pay these subsidies that are mostly going to benefit a company that is going to locate in a particular area, Arlington or Queens in New York City. And so people in the other parts of Virginia aren't going to see the kind of benefits that this subsidy is going to provide to the people in Arlington, which, let's be honest, I'm in Arlington, at the George Mason University campus here, and Arlington in Northern Virginia is the wealthiest area of the entire Commonwealth. If you wanted to stimulate economic growth, I would think that you would want to do something broad-based across the entire state rather than focus on the area that is already booming.
Yeah, I would have pointed to Danville and the South Bronx if I was looking for economically disparaged areas of Virginia and New York City to start with, but that was just me there. And again, you go back to a point that there really is no way Amazon's presence as corporate headquarters in either of these places is going to generate the kind of tax revenue to offset this impact on the state.
Definitely not when the state is handing back billions in potential tax revenue coming down the line. No, the fact of the matter is, again, just going back to the core conclusion of our research, this is a waste of money because Amazon and nearly every other company would locate where it's going to locate without the incentives. So that raises the question, though, why give the incentives if they don't actually work? They don't actually change the company's decision. And the answer to that, again, sounds a little cynical, but also a little humorous, that politicians wouldn't be able to claim credit for the jobs created if they didn't offer subsidies to the companies.
Oh, I don't disagree with that. But beyond that, isn't part of this and I talk to millennials frequently who claim that capitalism has damaged, and insert whatever it is that the millennial is begging for, and capitalism has ruined healthcare, capitalism has ruined the economy, housing, whatever, you name it. When we haven't really seen a capitalist free market in decades, Michael, because we have these massive companies that suck all the air out of the room economically, whereas, really what Adam Smith was talking about is, lots of little companies all biting at each other's heels, forcing them to, produce greater benefit for the consumer at a lower cost, and then paying their employees the highest possible wage because they want the best and brightest employees. That's when capitalism is the star of the world.
Absolutely. And Detroit is actually a great example of that. Not modern-day Detroit, mind you, but the Detroit of 100 years ago when Ford and Buick and GM were all getting started. And there was, a lot of people don't realize, there was hundreds of small car companies, not just in Detroit, but spread throughout the U.S., and it happened that Detroit was the best place to locate, was kind of a center in between the raw materials needed to make cars and the customer markets that the cars would eventually be sold to.
Right.
And so Detroit had a natural advantage. So the city leaders of Detroit wouldn't have needed to offer any subsidies to get car manufacturers to move there. They did it on their own accord because it was the best place. But then all of these companies struggling and competing with each other, just like you said, Ford actually increased his workers' wages, particularly to essentially attract and entice the best workers to come work for him away from the other companies. The other companies were extremely angry when Ford raised his wages. He billed it as that he wanted to make it so that his own workers would be able to afford the cars that they were making. Yep. But there was a business-based reason for it, which is I want the best workers to produce the best materials for my larger customer base. Well, and so, to the extent that companies can use government power, whether it's regulatory privileges or tax privileges or what have you, to get a benefit over their competitors that is outside of the customer market, that's no longer capitalism. A lot of people would call that cronyism, and that is what distorts us away from capitalism.
Michael, then how do we compete? And I hear the arguments, and I hear the arguments against our form of government, our representative republic. Well, the rest of the world doesn't behave this way, so this grand new world order, we need to be more like the rest of the world. Let's face it, we can't just sit here and pretend like the free markets and democratic principles are going to win the day when we're dealing with oligarchs and dictatorships, and now we're trading with these oligarchs and these dictatorships. So in order to compete fairly, we have to behave the same way. When did we lose that intestinal fortitude to say, no, we're different than you, and you have to compete with us? When did we lose that high ground, Michael?
Well, I'm not an economic historian, so I can't tell you exactly when that would have happened. But what I would argue is that we've always been engaged in a struggle to try to avoid corporate interests from having too much power in government, and to use that power to create monopolistic style privileges over their competitors. You can think back to about 40 years ago or so, the end of excessive regulation on airlines and interstate trucking and railroads that happened in the late 70s and early 80s that heralded a boom in economic growth because we got a lot of bad regulations out of the way that allowed airlines, and trains and everything else to start competing more efficiently. Prior to that, everybody looks at, it used to be so comfortable to fly, and that's because there were very severe price restrictions on what airlines could charge. So what they did is they offered you, enormous seats and steaks. They competed on quality rather than on price, and we had much less air travel as a result. It was luxurious air travel, but it was less available. What we have today is more competition on price, and so we have much more availability of air travel to an ordinary person, not just to someone who's upper middle class or wealthy.
The jet set, as it were. I was going to point to the telephone deregulations as well. Our founder, John Taylor, always points to the only innovation in telephone service for 100 years was the switch from a rotary to a touch tone. And then as soon as you break up Ma Bell, all of a sudden I have a computer in my pocket that, oh, by the way, also makes telephone calls. Yeah,
and I would say that the breaking up Ma Bell is a larger story that we could have another entire conversation about. Sure, but yeah. a big piece of that too was the opening up of the internet, and I think it was in 1996, to commercial activity. Prior to that, you weren't able to engage in transactions over the internet. And so that itself, just opening up that market in barely 20 years, has completely revolutionized our lives.
Bringing us full circle, Michael, back to Amazon, though, aren't we in the same dangerous place on a national scale with the internet that Detroit was? We talk about cars and GM now, but cars in Detroit and why Detroit became Detroit. Detroit and Michigan determined that they had the golden goose, or the goose that laid the golden egg, and they wound up strangling it to death. Don't we run the same risk with the internet and the idea of, the net neutrality and government incursions and allowing these big companies to sort of oligarch up on the internet and command such a presence on it, whereas it really should be much more of that wide open commerce driver that you mentioned earlier?
Without a doubt, the role of government and markets should be to encourage as wide open access to the market for as many players as possible, for as many companies as possible, and as many customers as possible, and to not find particular favorites and say, okay, you're doing it the right way. We're going to allow you to operate, but not someone else. The role of government is to avoid playing favorites, and to sum it up.
But to insist on internet sales tax collections kind of benefits an Amazon who can fold in the cost of compliance, whereas a small guy in Arlington, Virginia, trying to sell used books on the internet is now going to have to comply with, I forget the number, it's like 200 some odd different tax codes, and not just make sure they're collecting them, but each quarter filing a report to each one of those tax collecting agencies, New York City, New York State, so on and so forth down the line. Even if they didn't collect any sales tax, they're going to have to file a tax return each quarter with it, and that's just going to bury the little guys.
Absolutely. So what you're talking about indirectly is a term that we call regulatory capture, and that's where special interests and corporations can essentially capture government regulators, whether it's conscious or unconscious, and direct the resulting government policies in a way that benefits the large company at the expense of its competitors. And so it's entirely possible. You can look at the ruling on the internet sales taxes recently as a victory for the large corporations. This doesn't mean that, like Amazon, this doesn't mean necessarily that this is the exact result of regulatory capture, but it would fit the exact story of what we generally tell as regulatory capture, that once you get big enough and you're already filing sales taxes in every jurisdiction, that it no longer hurts you to have that as a requirement. And so it's easy to lobby for that as a requirement, which then hurts your smaller competition.
How do we make the case to Amazon then that, GM is their future? GM, the car company in Detroit, the collapsed, overly taxed, regulatory capture economy where they just tax those companies away. And I've even talked to some folks about the cafe standards being part of the reason GM was, losing market share because they were making unsellable cars just to meet the cafe standards of the government and that kind of thing. That Amazon should be pushing for more competition and less internet sales tax and that kind of thing because at some point they're going to be GM. I'm sure regulatory capture was great for GM at one point, but and the taxation structures of the automotive industry, if it kept out Nissan or Toyota or you name it, but once they started having to compete openly or even some semblance of openly, it was their death knell.
Absolutely. And this one interesting thing about Amazon is that they seem to be conscious of this. Jeff Bezos was recently quoted in an article saying that Amazon is going to fail. At some point in the future, Amazon will fail, just like Sears, fortunately or unfortunately, is failing now. Sears was the Amazon of 100 years ago, pioneering the catalog and the idea of distance-based commerce. And it served customers really well until it didn't anymore. Amazon is the next generation. Amazon is not likely to last indefinitely. And Bezos' argument was that our goal is simply to essentially prevent it from failing for the longest period of time, and the way to do that is to constantly reinvent and innovate in new industries. And so one of the interesting things I find about Amazon's entry into the D.C. area is, one, just being here, they should gain more influence over regulators. So that's kind of one of the side benefits of the D.C. area that probably had Amazon looking at D.C. even more than other cities, because it can essentially become a hometown company that regulators are more comfortable with, say. But that kind of government influence can be used for good or for evil. It can be used to ensure that other markets that Amazon is not currently competing in are kept open to new competition. The healthcare industry last year had a major shock when Amazon announced that it was going to start moving into healthcare. And healthcare stocks immediately dropped because whenever Amazon moves in, it disrupts the existing system, and by finding new ways to serve customers better. That's a good thing.
Yeah.
But it can also, if you're using it defensively, to allow yourself to move in and to create economic growth by serving customers better. But if it's used offensively to restrict competition by others, then that's the point where the government influence ends up being bad. And so I'm not sure what the future holds. It's probably a mixture of both. We'll have to see.
Well, I appreciate it, Michael. We are out of time. As a matter of fact, our next guest is going to talk about healthcare freedom on that level. Disruptors are good. Too big to fail isn't. And I just hope that someday we're not talking about how the government needs to help bail out Amazon because they're too big to fail, the way they've already done with some of the car companies in these legacy industries as well. But I really appreciate it. We're going to link up the piece you wrote along with Ann Philpott, The Study in American Capitalism. Amazon HQ is the only competition where the losers are the winners, and I appreciate it, and we really appreciate your visit this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll be right back with that next Healthcare Freedom on Freedom and Prosperity Radio next. Welcome back to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio. As always, remember, we can make sure that you have access to previous editions of the program. Go to tertiumquids.org, and you can find them all chronicled there for you if you go back and say, I remember hearing something about that. Joining us next, as I mentioned, we're talking about health freedom here. And Twila Brace is the president and co-founder of the Citizens Council for Health Freedom, and she's on the phone with us because they have a petition on President Trump's desk. Twila, welcome to the program. Good to meet you, and I hope you had a wonderful Thanksgiving. Thanks for joining us.
I did, and thank you for inviting me.
So now, explain to folks, your letter is a petition signed on to, and we here at the Virginia Institute have signed on to this petition as well, to try to ask the president to rescind an executive order put into place by President Obama regarding the coupling of Social Security and Medicare together. And if I'm understanding it correctly, that you can't access Social Security without also accepting Medicare under current executive order, correct?
That's correct. So back in the early 1990s, after President Clinton became President Clinton, that was one of the things that was done, is that a manual, a Social Security procedural manual, new wording, new verbiage was included to say that if you do not enroll in Medicare Part A, which is hospitalization, if you do not enroll in that, you will not be able to get access to your Social Security benefits, despite the fact that they have been taken away from you every year in every paycheck that you've ever received. And so, and then there was some other language added later in the early 2000s. But what we really want President Trump to do is to simply strip this language out of the operations manual. It's not a law. It's not a rule. There was never any public notice or comment. The Clintons simply added that language to the way that Social Security would run. And so really I can only make guesses as to why this might have happened.
Yeah.
Mrs. Clinton had a bill that she was essentially working on to take over the healthcare system, and her plan was really to bring together Medicare and Medicaid and to put other government programs in the middle and become one big national healthcare system. And so my guess is that she probably didn't want anybody to escape from Medicare and be able to keep private insurance or whatever else that they had that they wanted instead. And so this language was added, but I'm uncertain. It's just a guess. And but what we do know is that the language is there, and that the Social Security Administration is following that language, even though Congress has never approved it. There's been no rule issued that the public could have ever commented to say no, and so that's there. And so we're asking the president to simply strip out that language. So he doesn't need Congress, right? The president before him, that administration, put it in, and so all he has to do is take it out.
Let me ask you this then, Twila. Does it benefit the seniors who would like to keep their private insurance? Because if I'm not mistaken, if you have private insurance and you then go into Medicare, that you lose your conventional insurance. They won't cover you if you have Medicare.
So there are essentially different things that happen here. So a lot of insurance companies will not cover you once you hit age 65, and they tell you to go into Medicare. But there are individuals who also have employer-sponsored coverage that stays with them into retirement. But often what can happen there is that Medicare becomes their primary insurance then, and their private insurance becomes their secondary insurance, which means that they have to go through all the hurdles of Medicare before they can access the coverage that they could have had and the better coverage that they have under their secondary insurance. And so, those two things are at play. There's also the federal employee health benefits program, which also becomes secondary as soon as the individual hits Medicare age. And that is what, in 2008, there was a lawsuit against this language because these individuals wanted to keep their federal health benefits program as federal employees. They wanted to keep that because it was a better program. They wanted to keep that as primary coverage. But they could not because of Medicare and because of this language in the operations manual.
So you have to, if you want to accept your Social Security benefits, which you have to do, or you lose them, if I'm not mistaken. So either you get your Social Security or you never get Social Security when you reach eligibility age, and then you're really trapped in this box of having to drop what may be a much better health insurance system. And while we're having this debate, Twila, it strikes me that there are a lot of things out on the table, health savings accounts and primary care associations that are coming about, and President Trump has seemed interested, or at least expressed interest in supporting better access to that could be much better for a senior as they reach Medicare age. So this sounds like it's almost precluding any benefit that would come from a better medical care system.
That's right. Once you hit 65, you're trapped. And so we want to free seniors to have some of these other options. There are other reasons, of course, why seniors and listeners, your listeners who aren't even seniors, should be thinking about this. Because if we give seniors an escape route from Medicare, what we have essentially done is also opened up the possibility of a brand new market for lifelong health insurance that wouldn't leave anybody vulnerable to all the political machinations that happen around the Medicare program.
Oh, yeah.
Another reason is that Medicare is going bankrupt. According to the Medicare trustees, it's going to be insolvent in 2026. That's just 8 years from now, which means that several things are going to happen if Medicare still stays in place. Either our taxes are going to go sky high, the payroll tax, or the doctors are going to have more and more restrictions imposed on them, and patients are going to have less and less access to care. So that's just another reason to want to escape the Medicare program and be able to have private insurance. And yet another reason would be the fact of this whole movement to socialize the entire healthcare system called Medicare for All. The ability right now to get out of Medicare is next to none, because most people can't afford to lose their Social Security benefits and shouldn't have to.
Right.
But Medicare for All, one of the ways to put a protective hedge against ever going that direction is to give seniors the freedom to leave Medicare, to never go into Medicare, and to open up this lifelong insurance kind of a market. And so I think there are many reasons why this would be the perfect time for President Trump to simply sign an executive order and tell the Social Security Administration to strip that language out of the procedural operations manual. And we do have a petition for your listeners to sign, which is on our homepage at cchfreedom.org, cchfreedom.org. And they can ask President Trump also to do this. You know, this letter that we sent, it has 37 different organizations that signed besides us. So there are 38 co-signers and 40 signatures. And so it's all these groups around the nation, but we need the individuals around the country to also sign a petition to Trump that we will take to the administration to say, look, people all around the country believe that we should give seniors this kind of freedom in their retirement to not be on Medicare and to have private health insurance.
Twila, as somebody who's worked their entire career in the healthcare industry yourself before, founding the Citizens Council for Health Freedom, one of the problems that a lot of seniors have with Medicare is that there are doctors who are less than enthusiastic about accepting it, you get extremely limited options with it because it's got such a bad record of paying out benefits as well. So you wind up very restricted access to medical care as well.
Yes, and I think that there are several things happening that people in Medicare don't even understand. One is that there's this split in Medicare. Managed care Medicare, which is also called Medicare Advantage, which is the HMO or the health plan version. And then there's this original Medicare, which means you can go to any doctor anywhere. There's no networks, and it's more expensive because Congress really wants everybody to essentially go into the HMOs. With the HMOs, the health plans will control their access to care. So there's this thing that's happening that is more restrictive for people in the HMO version called Medicare Advantage. But another thing that's happening is that the administration, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, has one of their goals to move towards value-based payment of doctors and hospitals.
Oh, boy.
And, maybe value is a nice word, right? Everybody wants to pay for value, right?
Yeah.
However, it's really a socialistic activity, because what it's saying is that the outsiders who are outside of the exam room will look at the data in the electronic health record that's being collected on the doctor and on the patient. And I have an entire book about that called Big Brother in the Exam Room, which can be found at bigbrotherintheexamroom.com. So the whole idea here is that they will take the data out of the electronic health record, and they will take the cost, and they have an equation of quality versus cost, and then they will pay the doctor accordingly. Well, it really allows all the people on the outside to do all sorts of funny business with that equation in ways that will really discourage the doctors from providing care. It will perhaps do things like encourage them not to give more expensive care because, that'll change the cost-quality equation. It'll change how they use the electronic health record because they need to prove quality. So rather than focusing on the patient, they'll be focusing even more on the computer to try to click off all the boxes that prove quality to meet this equation. This is not freedom.
Oh gosh,
and
no.
There's nothing about it that's freedom. And we're very, very concerned about this movement of paying the doctors this way in the Medicare and Medicaid program, because this is really going to alter what's even available, we believe, for the patients.
This sounds very much like what was debated during Obamacare when the phrase death panels came up. And even Paul Krugman, one of the chief apologists for the administration during the build-up to Obamacare, said, well, no, they're not called death panels. They're advisability of care panels. But they certainly will look at, the potential of somebody. And it really was chilling to listen to the description of, penciling out, how much tax revenue are you going to generate in the future? And you start seeing this out of Britain, the National Health Services, and what is given as care to somebody who's in their senior years. I can imagine a child, an adult child, feeling like I want my mother taken care of, and having the government health services saying, no, she's too old for that now, but we will hospice her, for her remaining time when there's nothing critically wrong with her. She just needs a medical treatment. And I think that's an insidious place that I don't think our founding fathers ever expected our government to be.
Well, I'm certain our founding fathers never expected the government to be involved in healthcare, and it shouldn't. But I will say that the problem with value-based purchasing, which is what this is called, and this is part of the Affordable Care Act. This is part of what the Democrats put in under Obama. The problem with value-based payments for doctors is that it brings the death panel to. It really sort of makes the doctor and the hospital who are getting these payments, they become the rationers.
Oh.
Because they're actually thinking in that frame. They're not thinking about what's best for you, but will they get paid for it?
Yeah.
How much will they get paid for it? So they become the ones who just in their very own minds make decisions to give or to not give according to how they think they will or will not get paid, because you, the patient, are not paying the bill. And that's one thing that I make clear in my book. This whole idea of using the electronic health record to conduct surveillance and to control the doctor's hands is all because we do not pay our medical bills. We actually, what else do we do that we let people pay our bills? If we let people pay our bills for food, we would never have steak. We would go to no restaurants.
No, yeah,
right?
It would be complete control. But we see this in all these subsidies, university subsidies, hospital subsidies. It also creates, I've coined the phrase Munchausen by government syndrome, where the government creates the problem and then inserts itself in order to fix the problem. And it seems like that's exactly what this is doing, is it's creating more problems so that more government bureaucrats can come along and say, maybe at the behest of an elected official who needs the senior vote, look, we fixed it.
Yes, but there is no fixing while the government is still in there. It is the government's insertion into health care that has made it expensive, made it unavailable, put the doctors under somebody else's power. It is the problem. Wasn't it Ronald Reagan who said something about the government being the problem, not the solution, but the problem?
Yeah, that's. I think it was his first inaugural address. Government is not the answer to our problems. Government is our problem.
It is the problem. That's right. And so that's so true. And so for all the people who are dependent on Medicare, it should be there, although I don't even know if it'll be there for them. But we need to protect those who have been hurt by the government moving in this direction. But we really need, as an entire country, to move back to freedom, to move back to free markets. That's one of the reasons we have the wedge, which is a way to have doctors who are third-party payer-free. They don't take Medicare. They don't take Medicaid. They don't take insurance. They just take the patient, and the patient pays them in cash, check, or charge. And that's the direction we need to go back to.
Absolutely.
People may not remember that, but that's how it used to be, and that's why it was affordable, that's why it was personable, that's why it was confidential.
Well, and you had a doctor. You had a doctor and their nurses that had known you for years and could diagnose you very quickly because they had known you for years as well. I mean, it was it was a care. It wasn't just an industry. In there. Twila, where is that petition again for the listener to sign so that they can put their name on this as well?
So they can go to cchfreedom.org, cchfreedom.org.
And they can sign it. Now, is there a timeline where you want to put these on the president's desk so that, do you have a window of opportunity? What have you heard from the administration?
In the next week, we would like as many petitions in as possible in the next week.
All right. So we need to get on our computers right now and get signing that individually as citizens there. Have you had any discussions?
And send it to friends for them to sign, too.
Great point. Yeah, but have you had any discussions with anyone with connection to the administration as to whether the president, who seems to be receptive to these sorts of things when they're brought to his attention, to do this?
We're definitely having conversations with folks in the Trump administration. But, it's quite the deal to try to get all the way to the president. So we're doing everything possible to get all the way to the president. And the petitions, this letter, this letter co-signed by all these other organizations, this petition from people all around the country, we're doing our level best because we really believe this has to happen while Trump is president, that it would be hard to find any other president who would be willing to take this kind of a step.
Well, and you've seen proof being in the pudding. We've had Republicans and Democrats since it started, and nobody has thought to change it. As a matter of fact, the last Republican president made Medicare, some have said with Part D and the donut hole, even worse.
That's right.
So, who are you going to count on anymore? And again, at the end of it, it's not about throwing Granny from the train, which is sometimes the binary. Either it's Medicare or you just want Granny sick. It's actually just the opposite. I see this as being another instance where, as you said, the doctors and the insurance companies are set up as the ones who will be the bad guys. I can only imagine what the protest marches would be if some saintly grandmother from the black community didn't get health care treatment, and the protests that would begin, and just demanding that even though it was a bureaucratic decision, that somehow it was sex-based or race-based or anything like that. All these decisions that aren't supposed to be there that we're setting ourselves up for, Twila. And I appreciate you going out there again. And again, what was the website for your book?
BigBrotherInTheExamRoom.com.
Big Brother. Yes.
And just one thing about the Medicare petition, this is for people to voluntarily opt out of Medicare. Mm-hmm. We're not getting rid of Medicare. This is for anyone who wants to voluntarily opt out. We just want to give them the right to do so.
And you do not at this moment because, if you do, then you give up your Social Security benefits as well. Twila, thank you so much again. Twila Brace from the Citizens Council. And thank you very much for doing this to the Citizens Council for Health Freedom. Find the petition, sign it, send it to every friend you have. Do you have a Facebook page? They could share that as well, or just via the Facebook page as well?
Yep. CCH Freedom or Citizens Council for Health Freedom. And I have one, too, under my name.
Twila Brace, again, thank you so much for joining us this week, and I hope people pick up the book for some Christmas gift giving. I know that my family, that's what we like to do, is we like to give these thoughtful books to each other for those quiet, cold winter overnights of reading. So I appreciate it, and hopefully people will share it frequently. And thank you again for joining us this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.
Thank you.
And thank you for tuning in. As always, you can find copies of these programs up on our website, tertiumquids.org. Links to Twila's book and the petition as well up there. Until next week, for all of us here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy, my name is Joe Thomas. So long, and thanks for all the fish.